fraud affects our choices, costs, health, and trust in the food industry. In this video series, we're talking about food fraud and how it's being addressed in Canada. How can we defend against food fraud?
Great question. At the industry level, education and training on regulations is key. Ignorance of the regulations is no defense. And I just want to point out that education and training are not the same. They're very, very different. You can educate in the classroom, but you need to train in practice. And as our good friend Frankie Yanis, who's the Deputy Commissioner at the FTA, always focuses on, is a food safety culture. So when, that's behavior driven. So when you get into the education and training, you really want to know is, will the operators do the right thing if there's nobody looking? So, and I think it's relatively easy. I don't know what Kathy's opinion on this is, but it's relatively easy or easier to be able to ensure compliance for products, manufactured and processed in Canada. But it's products that come from overseas that we really have to defend against. And we do have, great regulations now in place with the Safe Food for Canadians Act, and companies have to get licenses. And if people want to look at the CFIA website, they are delisting companies who were originally certified. But the issue with that is the unobservability of what's going on, because as Kathy pointed out at the start, we have very complex global supply chains, and I'll argue later that they're not supply chains anymore, they're supply ecosystems with many service providers, raw material providers, and processors. And I think this is the challenge that we have, the globalness, the unobservability of it, and we need to address those challenges.
I want to mention that I think by setting up a reliable information tracking and tracing system to monitor the food process procedure and also along the whole supply chain or the supply ecosystem, and thus we can increase the cost of getting fraudulent products into the supply chain. So we reduce the benefit the fraudsters can get. Then there will be less fraudsters, will be less industry to do, less company to do this kind of fraudulent processing. And on the other hand, like the robust systems, most of them still rely on human to input the information. So there still could be chances the system can fail sometime. So in this case, I think that reliable analytical methods will be the last barrier to protect all the stakeholders from food fraud.
Starting with the CFIA, we're working to prevent food misrepresentation through kind of a prevent, detect, and to deter sort of theming. So examples of prevention, and this goes along the lines of what John was speaking of, and I have to say I very much appreciate his comment about a food safety culture. That's so key in all of this. But in the prevention space, we're looking at promoting industry and consumer awareness through tools such as the food labeling tool, industry food labeling tool, and the consumer labeling tool, and working with industry to encourage best practices such as supply chain controls, and carrying out some media and public affairs outreach as well. In terms of detecting, we're looking for areas of highest risk and conducting inspections and following up on complaints at different levels of trade, including domestic manufacturers and importers. We analyze food sample and verify that the composition complies with regulations, and as I've mentioned earlier, engage with other federal government departments, provinces, and other countries to identify and detect food fraud. And in the deter space, for example, when food products are clearly misrepresented and not compliant with regulatory requirements, the CFIA will take appropriate regulatory action or enforcement action, and in some cases will recommend prosecution. And this depends, of course, on the severity of the violation, the history of compliance of the regulated party, and the intention of the act. But as I said, it's important that other players in the marketplace are pulling their weight in this space. So industry has a major role in this. Industry is responsible for the compliance of their food. And so as John had mentioned, knowing the laws and meeting those requirements is key. Verifying the authenticity of ingredients used in the manufacturing process of food products and obtaining ingredients and products from trusted suppliers. Good importing practices and manufacturing practices are key, preventative control plans, and keeping good records that track the path of the product through the system. Training and supervision of employees is also important, and alerting the CFIA in cases of suspected food misrepresentation. Consumers, though, also, I mean, there's so many players who have important roles. I'm thinking academia as well, but we'll just focus down on consumers. And consumers having awareness of the requirements and checking and reading labels to see if any information seems to be off. Earlier in this session, John had mentioned something I found interesting that might tip you off, like spelling mistakes. Considering the price. If the price seems too good to be true, then maybe it is. And contacting industries such as grocery stores, manufacturers, producers, or associations or importers to report concerns and ask questions about the information on the label or how the food is made. Consumer awareness encourages industry to also be more vigilant about how products are represented. And then, of course, from the consumer perspective, reporting potential issues and concerns to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency.
Everyone has a role to play in addressing the risks and concerns of food fraud. We asked the CFIA what classes of products they look into.
As part of the Food Fraud Initiative, Canada conducts global environmental scanning. As I mentioned, we collect information and we're looking for risks. And as I mentioned earlier as well, we look then into the Canadian context, and that helps us identify areas of concern, such as past non-compliance and complaints. CFIA uses a risk-based approach in tackling the issues in Canada, and we conduct targeted sampling and testing to detect misrepresentation in foods. We also do ongoing marketplace monitoring for food safety and authenticity. And so, for example, we routinely test things like cinnamon and vanilla authenticity for the presence of undeclared colors or sugars in juices or sugars in honey. And those are just some examples. And on our website, we have reports highlighting the results of some of this work. So the data that we have collected through the various monitoring information and inspection information helps us then to retarget and with our future planning and develop strategies that allows us, as I said, to have a risk-based approach to managing food fraud.
We all have a role to play, with consumer awareness and reporting being used to inform regulators. When you're buying your products, watch the labels and the pricing. If you see something unusual, you can report it to the CFIA or the company. Find out more about what it takes to uncover food fraud in our next video.